Alright, welcome back to Paper Cuts, everyone. Last we left off, we got a little ways into the Dunwich horror, and now we're going to attempt to finish things up. We're on Chapter 10, so let's begin. In the end, the three men from Arkham, old, white-bearded Dr. Armitage, stocky, iron-gray Professor Rice, and lean, youngish Dr. Morgan, ascended the mountain alone. After much patient instruction regarding its focusing and use, they left the telescope with a frightened group that remained in the road, and as they climbed they were watched closely by those among whom the glass was passed around. It was hard going, and Armitage had to be helped more than once. High above the toiling group, the great swath trembled as its hellish maker repassed with snail-like deliberateness. Then it was obvious that the pursuers were gaming. No, they weren't playing Fortnite, they were gaining. The pursuers were gaining. Curtis Wadley of the Undecayed branch was holding the telescope when the Arkham party detoured radically from the swath. He told the crowd that the men were evidently trying to get to a subordinate peak which overlooked the swath at a point considerably ahead of where the shrubbery was now bending. And this indeed proved to be true, and the party were seen to gain the minor elevation only a short time after the invisible blasphemy had passed it. And then Wesley Corey, who had taken the glass, cried out that Armitage was adjusting the sprayer which Rice held, and that something must be about to happen. The crowd stirred uneasily, recalling that the sprayer was expected to give the unseen horror a moment of visibility. 2 or 3 men shut their eyes, but Curtis snatched back the telescope and strained his vision to the utmost. He saw that Rice, from the party's point of vantage above and behind the entity, had an excellent chance of spreading the potent powder with a marvelous effect. And those without the telescope saw only an instant's flash of grey cloud, a cloud about the size of a moderately large building near the top of the mountain, and Curtis, who had held the instrument, dropped it with a piercing shriek into the ankle-deep mud of the road. He reeled and would have crumpled to the ground had not 2 or 3 others seized and steadied him, and all he could do was moan half inaudibly. That. And there was a pandemonium of questioning, and only Henry Wheeler had thought to rescue the fallen telescope and wipe it clean of mud. Curtis was past all coherence, and even isolated replies were almost too much for him. Bigger than a barn, all made of squirming ropes. Whole thing sort of shaped like a hen's egg, bigger than anything. Dozens of legs like hogsheads, half shut up when they step. Nothing solid about it, all like jelly, and they made of separate wriggling ropes pushed close together. Great bulging eyes all over it, 10 or 20 mouths, their trunks sticking all along the sides, big as stovepipes, and all the tossing and opening and shutting, all gray with kind of blue or purple rings. Oh, God in heaven, that half face on top. And this final memory, whatever it was, proved too much for poor Curtis, and he collapsed completely before he could say more. Fred Farr and Will Hutchins carried him to the roadside and laid him on the damp grass. Henry Wheeler, trembling, turned the rescued telescope on the mountain to see what he might. Through the lenses, were discernible 3 tiny figures, apparently running toward the summit as fast as the steep incline allowed. Only these, nothing more. Then everyone noticed a strangely unseasonable noise in the deep valley behind, and even in the underbrush of the Sentinel Hill itself. It was the piping of unnumbered whippoorwills, and in their shrill chorus there seemed to lurk a note of tense and evil expectancy. Earl Sawyer now took the telescope and reported the 3 figures as standing on the topmost ridge, virtually level with the altar stone, but at a considerable distance from it. One figure, he said, seemed to be raising its hands above its head at a rhythmic interval, and as Sawyer mentioned the circumstance, the crowd seemed to hear a faint, half-musical sound from the distance, as if a loud chant were accompanying the gestures. The weird silhouette on that remote peak must have been a spectacle of infinite grotesqueness and impressiveness, but no observer was in a mood for aesthetic appreciation. "I guess he's saying the spell," whispered Wheeler as he snatched back the telescope. The whippoorwills were piping wildly in a singularly curious, irregular rhythm, quite unlike that of the visible ritual. Suddenly the sunshine seemed to lessen without the intervention of any discernible cloud. It was a very peculiar phenomena, and was plainly marked by all. A strange, rumbling sound seemed to brew beneath the hills, mixed oddly with a concordant rumbling which clearly came from the sky. Lightning flashed aloft, and the wondering crowd looked in vain for the portents of a storm. The chanting of the men from Arkham now became unmistakable, and Wheeler saw through the glass they were all raising their arms in rhythmic incantation. From some farmhouse far away came the frantic barking of dogs. The change in quality of the daylight increased, and the crowd gazed about the horizon in wonder. A purplish darkness, born of nothing more than a spectral deepening of the sky's blue, pressed down upon the rumbling hills. And then the lightning flashed again, somewhat brighter than before, and the crowd fancied that it had showed a certain mistiness around the altar stone at a distant height. No one, however, had been using telescope at that instant. The whippoorwills continued their irregular pulsation, and the men of Dunwich braced themselves tensely against some imponderable menace which the atmosphere seemed surcharged. Without warning came those deep, cracked, raucous vocal sounds which will never leave the memory of the stricken group who heard them. Not from any human throat were they born, for the organs of man can yield no such acoustic perversions. Rather, one would have said they came from the pit itself, had not their source been so unmistakably the altar stone and the peak. It's almost erroneous to call them sounds at all, since so much of their ghastly, infra-bass timbre spoke to dim seats of consciousness and terror far subtler than the ear. And yet one must do so, since their form was indisputably, though vaguely, that of half-articulate words. They were loud as the rumblings and the thunder above which they echoed, and yet they did come from no visible being. And because imagination might suggest a conjectural source in the world of non-visible beings, the huddled crowd at the mountain's base huddled still closer and winced as if in expectation of a blow. You know, Yog-Sohoth. It rang, the hideous croaking out of space. You think the speaking impulse seemed to falter here, as if some frightful psychic struggle were going on. Henry Wheeler strained his eye at the telescope, but saw only the three grotesquely silhouetted human figures on the peak, all moving their arms furiously in strange gestures as their incantation drew near its culmination. From what black wells of echironic fear or feeling, from what unplumbed gulfs of extra-cosmic consciousness or obscure, long-latent hereditary, were those half-articulate thunder-croakings drawn. Presently they began to gather renewed force and coherence, as they drew in stark, utter, ultimate frenzy. But that was all. The pallid group in the road still reeling at the indisputably English syllables that had poured thickly and thunderously down from the frantic vacancy beside that shocking altar stone, were never to hear such syllables again. Instead, they jumped violently at the terrific report which seemed to bend the hills, the deafening, cataclysmic peal whose source, be it inner earth or sky, no hearer was ever able to place. A single lightning bolt shot from the purple zenith to the altar stone, and a great tidal wave of viewless force and indescribable stench swept down from the hill to the countryside. Trees, grass, and the underbrush were whipped into a fury, and the frightened crowd at the mountain's base, weakened by the lethal fetter that seemed almost to asphyxiate them, were almost hurled off their feet. Dogs howled from the distance, green grass and foliage wilted to a curious sickly yellow-gray, and over field and forest were scattered the bodies of dead whippoorwills. The stench left quickly, but the vegetation never came right again. To this day there is something strange and unholy about the growths on and around that fearsome hill. Curtis Wadley was only just regaining consciousness when the Arkham men came slowly down the mountain in the beams of sunlight, once more brilliant and untainted. They were grave and quiet, and seemed shaken by memories and reflections even more terrible than those which had reduced the group of natives to a state of coward quivering. In reply to a jumble of questions, they only shook their heads and reaffirmed one vital fact. "The thing is gone forever. It has been split up into what it was originally made of and can never exist again. It was an impossibility in a normal world. Only the least fraction was really matter in any sense we know. It was like its father, and most of it's gone back to him in some vague realm or dimension outside our material universe. Some vague abyss out of which only the most accursed rites of human blasphemy could ever have called him for a moment on the hills," Armitage exposited to the locals. And there was a brief silence, and in that pause the scattered senses of poor Curtis Wadley began to knit back into a sort of continuity, so that he put his hands up to his head with a groan. Memory seemed to pick up where it left off, and the horror of the sight that had prostrated him burst in upon him again. "Oh, my God. That half-face on top of it, the face with the red eyes and the crinkly albino hair and the chin like Wadley's. It was an octopus, a centipede, spider kind of thing, and this half-shaped man's face on top of it looked like Wizard Wadley's, only it was yards and yards across." And he paused, exhausted, as the whole group of natives stared in a bewilderment not quite crystallized into fresh terror. Only old Zebulon Wadley, who wanderingly remembered ancient things but who had been silent heretofore, spoke aloud. 15 years ago, I heard old Wadley say as though someday we hear a child of Vinny's and call his father's name on top of the Centennial Hill. But Osborne interrupted him to question the Arkham men anew. "What was it anyhow, and how did Wadley call it out of the air where it come from?" Armitage chose his words carefully. It was mostly a kind of force that doesn't belong in our part of space. A kind of force that acts and grows and shapes itself by other laws than those of our sort of nature. We have no business calling in such things from outside, and the only very wicked people and very wicked cults try to. There was some of it in Wilbur Wadley himself, enough to make a devil and a precocious monster of him, and to make his passing out a terrible sight. I'm going to burn his accursed diary, and if you men are wise, you'll dynamite that altar stone up there and pull down all the rings of standing stones on the other hills. Things like that brought down the beings those Wadleys were fond of, the beings they were going to let in tangibly to wipe out the human race and drag the earth off to some nameless place for some nameless purpose. But as to this thing we've just sent back, the Wadleys raised it for a terrible part in the doings that were to come. It grew fast and big from the same reason Wilbur grew fast and big, but it beat him because it had a greater share of the outsideness in it. You needn't ask how Wilbur called it out of the air. He didn't call it out. It was his twin brother, but it looked more like the father than he did. All right, that is the end of the Dunwich horror. So we've got a lot of time to try and find our next story. I'm going to just throw out a short story. Just give me a moment, I have to find that. Okay, after a great deal of off-screen deliberation, I've settled on a short story called Ring Once for Death. 20 years had left no trace inside Sam Key's little shop on Mott Street. There were the same dusty jars of ginseng root and tiger's whiskers, the same little bronze Buddhas, the same gimcracks mixed with fine jade. Edith Williams gave a little murmur of pleasure as the door shut behind them. "Mark, it hasn't changed. It doesn't look as if a thing has been sold since we were here on our honeymoon." "It certainly doesn't," Dr. Williams agreed, moving down the narrow aisle behind her. "If someone hadn't told us Sam Key was dead, I'd believe we'd step 20 years back in time like they do in those scientific stories young David reads." We simply must buy something. A 20th anniversary present for me. Perhaps a bell?" From the shadowy depths of a shop, a young man emerged, American in dress and manner despite the oriental contours of his face and eyes. "Good evening. May I show you something?" "We think we want a bell, but we aren't quite sure. You're Sam Key's son?" "Sam Key, Jr. My honored father passed to the halls of his ancestors 5 years ago. I can just say that he died," and at this his black eyes twinkled. "But customers like the more flowery mode of speech. They think it's quaint." I think it's just nice and not quaint at all. We're sorry your father's dead. We hope to see him again. 20 years ago, when we were a very young, broke couple, on honeymoon here, he sold us a wonderful rose crystal necklace for half price. I'm sure he still made a profit." His eyes twinkled again. "But if you'd like a bell, here are small temple bells, camel bells, dinner bells." But even as he spoke, Edith Williams' hand darted to something at the back of the shelf. "A bell carved out of crystal, and rose crystal at that. What could be more perfect? A rose crystal wedding present and a rose crystal anniversary present." And the young man half stretched out his hand. "I don't think you want that. It's broken." "Broken?" Edith rubbed it off the dust and held the lovely bell shape of crystal, the size of a pear, to the light. "It looks perfect to me." "I mean it is not complete." Something of the American had vanished from the young man. "It has no clapper. It will not ring." "Why, that's right. The clapper's missing." "We can have another clapper made, that is, if the original can't be found." The young man shook his head. "The bell and clapper were deliberately separated by my father 20 years ago." And he hesitated, and then added, "My father was afraid of this bell." "Afraid of it?" Mark raised his eyebrows, and the other hesitated again. "It will probably sound like a story for tourists, but my father believed it. This bell was supposedly stolen from a temple of a sect of Buddhists somewhere in the mountains of China's interior, just as many Occidentals believe that on the Christian Judgment Day will be heralded by a blast on St. Peter's trumpet. So this small sect is said to believe that when a bell like this one is rung, a bell carved from a single piece of rose crystal and consecrated by ceremonies lasting 10 years, any dead within sound of it will rise and live again." "Heavenly! And no pun intended. Mark, think what a help this bell will be in your practice when we make it ring again." To the Chinese man she added, smiling, "I'm just teasing you. Oh, my husband really is a fine surgeon." And the other bowed his head. I must tell you, you will not be able to make it ring. Only the original clapper carved from the same block of rose crystal will ring it. That is why my father separated them." And again he hesitated. "I have only told you half of what my father told me. He said that though it defeats death, death cannot be defeated. Robbed of his chosen victim, he takes another in its place. Thus, when the bell was used in the temple of its origin, let us say when a high priest or a chief had died, a slave or servant was placed handy for death to take, when he'd been forced to relinquish his grasp upon the important one." And he smiled and shook his head. "There, it's just such a preposterous story. Now, if you wish it, the bell is $10, plus, of course, sales tax." "The story alone's worth more. I think we'd better have it sent, hadn't we, Edith? It'll be safer in the mail than in our suitcase." "Sent?" His wife seemed to come out of some deep meditation. "Oh, of course. And as for its not ringing, I shall make it ring. I know I shall."
"If the story's true, I sure hope not."
And the package came on a Saturday morning, when Mark was catching up on the latest medical publications in his untidy book-lined study. He heard Edith unwrapping paper in the hall outside, and then she came in with the rose crystal bell in her hands. "Mark, it's here. Now let's make it ring." And she plopped herself down beside his desk. He took the bell and reached for silver pencil. Just for the sake of curiosity, and not because I believe that delightful sales talk we were given. Let's see if it'll ring when I tap it. It should, you know." And he tapped the lip of the bell. A muted thunk was the only response. Then he tried with a coin, a paper knife, and the bottom of a glass. In each instance, the resultant sound was nothing like a bell ringing. "If you've finished, Mark," Edith said then with tolerance, "let me show you how it's done."
"Gladly,"
her husband agreed, and she took the bell and turned away for a moment. And then she shook the bell vigorously, and a clear, sweet ringing shivered through the room, so thin and ethereal that small involuntary shivers crawled up his spine. "Good heavens, how did you do that?" "I just put the clapper back in place with some thread." "The clapper? Oh, don't tell me, the crystal necklace we bought 20 years ago." "Of course. As soon as young Sam Key told us about his father separating the clapper and the bell, I remembered the central crystal pendant on my necklace. It's shaped like a bell clapper. We mentioned it once. I guessed right away that I had the missing clapper, but I didn't say so. I wanted to score on you, Mark," and she smiled affectionately at him. "And because, I had a strange feeling that Sam Key Jr. wouldn't let us have the bell if he guessed we had the clapper." "I don't think he would." Mark picked up his pipe and rubbed the bowl with his thumb. "And yet he didn't really believe that story he told us any more than we do." "No, but his father did, and if old Sam Key had told it to us, remember how wrinkled and wise he seemed? I do believe we'd have believed that story." "Well, you're probably right." Dr. Williams rang the bell and waited. The thin, sweet sound seemed to hang in the air a long moment and then was gone. Nope, nothing happened. Although that, of course, may be because there was no deceased around to respond. "I'm not sure I like joking about the story." A small frown gathered on Edith's forehead. "I'd planned to use the bell as a dinner bell and to tell the story to our guests, but now I'm not sure." Frowning, she stared at the bell until the ringing of the telephone in the hall brought her out of her abstraction. "Sit still, I'll answer." She hurried out, and Dr. Williams, turning the rose crystal bell over in his hand, could hear the sudden tension in her voice as she answered. He was on his feet when she re-entered. "An emergency operation at the hospital. Nice young man, automobile accident. Fracture of the skull, Dr. Amos says. He wouldn't have disturbed you, but you're the only brain man in town with Dr. Hendricks away on vacation." "I know." He was already in the hall, reaching for his hat. "Man's work is from sun to sun, but a doctor's work is never done," he misquoted. "I'll drive you. You sit back and relax for another 10 minutes. 2 hours later, as they drove homeward, the traffic was light, which was fortunate. More than once, Mark, in a frowning abstraction, found himself on the left of the center lane and had to pull back into his own. He'd lost patience before, but never without a feeling of personal defeat. Edith said that he put too much of himself into every operation, and perhaps he did. And yet, no, there was every reason why that young man should have lived. And yet, just as Mark Williams has felt that he'd been successful, the patient died. In 20 years of marriage, Edith Williams had learned to read his thoughts at times, and now she put a hand comfortingly on his arm. "These things happen, darling. You know that. A doctor can only do so much. Some of the job always remains in the hands of nature, and she does play tricks at times." "Yes, confound it, I know it. But I resent losing that lad. There was no valid reason for it. Unless there was some complication I overlooked." He shook his head, scowling. "I ordered an autopsy, but... Yes, I'm going to do that autopsy myself. I'm going to turn back and do it now. I have to know." He turned abruptly to the left to swing into a side road and turn, and Edith Williams never saw the car that hit him. She heard the frantic blare of a horn and a scream of brakes, and in a frozen instant realized that there had been someone behind them about to pass. And then the impact came, throwing her forward into the windshield and unconsciousness. Edith opened her eyes, and even before she realized that she was lying on the ground, and the figure bending over her was a state trooper, she remembered the crash. Her head hurt, but there was no confusion in her mind. Automatically, even as she tried to sit up, she accepted the fact that there had been a crash, help had come, and she must have been unconscious for several minutes at least. "Whoa there, lady, take it easy. You had a bad bump. You gotta lie still until the ambulance gets here. It'll be along in 5 minutes.
Mark, my husband, is he all right?
Now, lady, please, he's being taken care of.
But she wasn't listening. Holding to his arm, she pulled herself to a sitting position, and she saw their car on its side some yards away, other cars pulled up around them, a little knot of staring people. She saw them and dismissed them, and her gaze found her husband, lying on the ground a few feet away, a coat folded beneath his head. Mark was dead. She'd been a doctor's wife for 20 years, and before that she'd been a nurse. She knew death when she saw it.
Mark.
The word was spoken to herself, but the trooper took it for a question.
Yeah, lady. Well, he's dead. He was still breathing when I got here, but he died maybe 2 or 3 minutes ago.
She got to her knees, and her only thought was to reach his side. She scrambled across the few feet of ground on her hands and knees, and crouched beside him, fumbling for his pulse. There was none. There was nothing. Just a man who had been alive and now was dead. Behind her, she heard a voice raised, and she turned. A large, disheveled man was standing beside the trooper, talking loudly.
Now, listen, officer. I'm telling you again, it wasn't my fault. The guy pulled a sharp left right in front of me. Nothing I could do. It's a wonder we weren't all 3 of us killed. You can see by the marks on their car it wasn't my fault.
Edith Williams closed her mind to the voice, and she let Mark's hand lie in her lap as she fumbled in her bag, which was somehow still clutched in her fingers. She groped for a handkerchief to stem the tears which would not be held back. Something was in the way, something smooth and hard and cold. She drew it out and heard the thin, sweet tinkle of the crystal bell. She must have dropped it automatically into her bag as they were preparing to leave the house, and the hand in her lap moved. She gasped and bent forward as her husband's eyes opened.
Mark, darling.
Edith, Mark said with an effort. Sorry. That was careless of me, thinking of the hospital.
You're alive. Oh, darling, lie still. The ambulance will be here any second.
Ambulance? I'm all right now. Help me sit up.
But, Mark...
It was just a bump on the head. Then he struggled to sit up, and the trooper came over. Whoa there, easy, buddy. We thought you were gone. Now let's not lose you a second time.
Whoa, I'm sure glad you're all right,
the red-faced man said in a rush of words.
Well, fellow, you had me upset even if it wasn't my fault. I'll tell you what, how's the guy going to keep from hitting you when...
Catch him!
Mark cried, but the trooper was too late. The other man plunged forward to the ground and lay where he'd fallen, without quivering. The clock in the hall struck 2 with muted strokes. Cautiously, Edith rose on her elbow and looked down at her husband's face. His eyes opened and looked back at her.
You're awake.
Woke up a few minutes ago. I've been lying here, thinking.
I'll go get you another phenobarbital. Then Dr. Amos said for you to take them and sleep until tomorrow.
I know. I'll take one presently. You know, hearing that clock just reminded me of something.
Yes?
Just before I came to this afternoon, after the crash, I had a strange impression of hearing a bell ring. It sounded so loud in my ears I opened my eyes to see where it was.
A bell?
Yes, just auditory hallucination, of course.
But, Mark...
Yes?
A bell did ring. I had the crystal bell in my bag, and it rang, tinkled a little. Do you suppose?
Of course not. But though he spoke swiftly, he didn't sound like he was convinced. This was a loud bell, like a great gong.
But, I mean, Mark, darling, a moment earlier you had no pulse.
No pulse?
And you weren't breathing. And then the crystal bell rang and you...
Nonsense. I know what you're thinking. Believe me, it's nonsense.
But, Mark, the driver of the other car, you had no sooner regained consciousness than he
had a fractured skull. The ambulance intern diagnosed it. And then... Well, you know, skull fractures often fail to show themselves, and bingo, you keel over. That's what happened. Now let's say no more about it.
Of course.
In the hall, the clock struck the quarter hour.
Shall I fix the phenobarbital now?
Yet, no. Is David home?
No, he hasn't gotten back yet.
Has he phoned? He knows he's supposed to be in by midnight at the latest.
No, he hasn't phoned. There's a school dance tonight.
That's no excuse for not phoning. He used the old car, hasn't he?
Yes, you gave him the keys this morning.
All the more reason he should phone. Williams lay silent a moment. 2 o'clock's too late for a 17-year-old boy to be out.
I'll speak to him. He won't do it again. Now, please, Mark, let me get you the phenobarbital. I'll stay up until David...
The ringing phone, a clamor in the darkness, interrupted her, and Williams reached for it. The extension was beside his bed. "Hello?" he said, and then although she couldn't hear the answering voice, she felt him stiffen, and she knew, as well as if she could hear the words, she knew with a mother's instinct for disaster. Yes. I see, yes. I understand. I'll come at once. Thank you for calling." And he slid out of bed before she could stop him. "An emergency call. I have to go." He began to throw on his clothes.
It's David, isn't it? Don't try to keep me from knowing. It's about David.
Yes. His voice was very tired. David is hurt. I have to go to him. There was an accident.
He's dead. David's dead, isn't he, Mark?
And he came over and sat beside her and put his arms around her. Edith, yes, he's dead. 40 minutes ago, the car went over a curve. They have him at the county morgue. They want me to identify him. Identify him, Edith. The car. It caught fire.
I'm coming with you. I'm coming with you.
The taxi waited in a pool of darkness between 2 streetlights. The long, low building, which was the county morgue, a blue lamp over its door, stood below street level. A flight of concrete steps went down to it from the sidewalk. 10 minutes before, Dr. Mark Williams had gone down those steps, and now he climbed back up them, stiffly, wearily, like an old man. Edith was waiting in the taxi, sitting forward on the edge of the seat, her hands clenched. As he reached the last step, she opened the door and stepped out.
Mark, was it?
Yes. It's David, our son. I've completed the formalities. For now, the only thing we can do is go home.
I'm going to him.
She tried to pass, and he caught her wrist. Discreetly, the taxi driver pretended to doze. No, Edith. There's no need. You mustn't see him.
He's my son. Let me go.
No. What have you got under your coat?
It's the bell. The rose crystal bell. I'm going to ring it where David can hear.
Defiantly, she brought forth her hand, clutching the little bell.
It brought you back, Mark, and now it's going to bring back David.
Edith, you mustn't believe that's possible. You can't. Those were coincidences. Now, let me have it.
No, I'm going to ring it. I want David back. I'm going to ring the bell.
And she got her hand free. The crystal bell rang in the quiet of the early morning with an eerie thinness, penetrating the silence like a silver knife.
There, I've rung it now. I know you don't believe, but I do. It'll bring David back.
and she raised her voice. "David! David, son, can you hear me?" "Edith, you're just tormenting yourself. Come on, please come home." "Not until David's come back. David, David, can you hear me?" Then she rang the bell again, rang it until Dr. Williams seized it, then she let him take it. Edith, if only you'd let me come alone." "Mark, listen." "What?" "Listen," she whispered with a fierce urgency. He was silent, and then the fingers of horror drew themselves down his spine at the clear, youthful voice that came up to them from the darkness below. "Mom? Dad? Where are you?" "David. It's David. Let me go. I must go to him." "No, Edith." Her husband whispered frantically as the voice below called again. "Dad? Mother? Are you up there? Wait for me." "Let me go. David, we're up here, son." "Edith, if you've ever loved me, please, listen to me. You mustn't go down there. David, I had to identify him by his class ring and his wallet. He was burned, terribly burned." "I'm going to him." She wrenched herself free and sped for the steps, up which now was coming a tall form, a shadow shrouded in the darkness. Dr. Williams, horror knotting his stomach, leapt to stop her, but he slipped and fell headlong on the pavement, so that she was able to pant down the stairs to meet the upcoming figure. "David! David!" "Hey, Mom. I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry." And the boy held her steady. But I didn't know what happened until I got home, and you weren't there, and then one of the fellows from the fraternity didn't... Well, he called me. I recognized they must have made a mistake, but... you'd come here, I called for a taxi, and I came out here. My taxi let off at the entrance round the block, and I've been looking for you down there. Poor Pete." "Pete?" "Pete Friedberg. He was driving the old car. I lent him the keys and my driver's license. I shouldn't have, but he's older and he kept begging me." "Then it's Pete who was killed? Pete who was burned?" "Yeah, Pete. I feel terrible about lending him the car, but he was supposed to be a good driver, and then calling you and Dad thinking it was me." "Then Mark was right. Of course he was right. It's just a bell, a pretty little bell, that's all." "Bell? I don't follow you, Mom." "Never mind. It's just a bell. It doesn't have any power over life and death. It doesn't bring back, and it doesn't take away. Let's get back up to your father. He may be thinking the bell really worked." They climbed the rest of the steps. Dr. Mark Williams still lay where he had fallen, headlong on the pavement. The cab driver was bending over him, but there was nothing to be done. The crystal bell had been beneath him when he fell, and it had broken. One long, fine splinter of crystal was embedded in his heart. All right. That was very dramatic, very suitably spooky. I think I've used that as an actual, title for, I think I've used that as an episode title, like a previous episode title. Oh, now what? I suppose we can read The Sound of Silence now. Now that we're, Oh dear, I bumped the mic. Apologies. Give me a moment to just cue up The Sound of Silence, and we'll get there. Let's begin on The Sound of Silence, shall we? Most people, when asked to define the ultimate in loneliness, say it's being alone in a crowd, and it only takes one slight difference to make one forever alone in the crowd. Nobody at Hoskins, Haskell, and Chapman Incorporated knew just why Lucilia Brown, G.G. Hoskins' secretary, came to work half an hour early every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. "And I've definitely read this on stream before," he said. No, I've definitely read this on stream before. I knew I read Sound of Silence on stream before. Gosh dang it. Give me a second. I need to find a different one. Need to find something else to read. Or we could just have a short episode. I mean, that's not the end of the world. It may be just a good day to have a short episode, and then we'll pick up next week with something new. But I kind of want to... hang on, let me look at a calendar. I need to check things. This is how prepared I am about things. Oh yeah, I got two episodes before we gotta start March. So I think rather than trying to dig through my book reader and trying to find like a billion short stories to try and fill the remaining hour that would normally be this episode, I think we're just gonna call it an evening there. I lied. I found one. Oh, I found one that maybe might be a little incongruous with my family friendly intent here, but it's called Week on Square Roots, and this is your content warning. This one gets a little not family friendly, and I won't tell you how because that's a spoiler, but it gets not family friendly right at the end. So if you're not, one that's supposed to be listening to not family friendly things, please don't stick around. We're going to start right now. Week on Square Roots. As his coach sped through dusk-darkened Jersey meadows, Ronald Lovegear, 14 years with Allied Electronics, embraced his burden with both arms, silently cursing the engineer who deliberately rocked the train. In his thin chest, he nursed the conviction that someday there'd be an intelligent robot at the throttle of the 510 to Philadelphia. He carefully moved one hand and took a notebook from his pocket. That would be a good thing to mention at the office next Monday. Again, he congratulated himself for having induced his superiors to let him take home the company's most highly developed mechanism to date. He'd already forgiven himself for the little white lie that morning. Pascal, he'd told them, is a little weak on square roots, and that had done it. Old Hardwick would never permit an Allied computer to hit the market that was not an absolute master of square roots. If Lovegear wanted to work on Pascal in his own time, then it was fine with the boss. Ronald Lovegear consulted his watch. He wondered if his wife would be on time. He'd told Corinne twice over the phone to bring the station wagon to meet him, but she'd been so forgetful lately. It was probably the new house. 6 rooms to keep up without a maid was quite a chore. It would help that if you helped her. His pale eyes blinked. He had a few ideas along that line, too. He smiled and gave the crate a gentle pat. Corinne was at the station, and she'd brought the station wagon. Lovegear managed to get the crate into the stairs of the coach, where he consented to the assistance of a porter. It's not really heavy, he told Corinne as he and the porter waddled through the crowd. Actually, only 57 pounds and 4 ounces. Aluminium casing, No, I didn't. But it's delicate. If I should drop this. Oh. After the crate had been placed lengthwise in the rear of the station wagon, Corinne watched Ronald tuck a blanket around it. It's not very cold, Ronald. I don't want it to get bounced around. Now, please, Corinne, do drive carefully. And not until she had driven half a block did he kiss her on the cheek. Then he glanced anxiously over his shoulder at the rear seat. And once he thought Corinne hit a rut that could have been avoided. Long after Corinne had retired that night, she heard Ronald pounding with a brass hammer down in his den. At first she insisted he take the crate out to his workshop, and he looked at her with scientific aloofness and asked if she had the slightest conception of what this is worth. And she had, and she went to bed. It was only one of his gestures, it was only another one of his weird gestures, which was responsible for these strange dreams. That night she dreamed Ronald had brought home a giant octopus, which insisted on doing the dishes for her. And in the morning she woke up feeling unwanted. Downstairs, Ronald had already put on the coffee. He was wearing his robe, and the pinched grayness of his face told Corinne that he'd been up half the night, and he poured coffee for her, smiling wanly. If I have any commitments today, Corinne, can you please see they're taken care of? But you were supposed to get the wallpaper for the guest room.
I know, dear, but time is so short. They might want Pascal back any day. For the next week or two I shall want to devote most of my time.
Pascal?
Yes, the machine, the computer. He smiled at her ignorance. We usually name the expensive jobs. You see, a computer of this nature is really the heart and soul of the mechanical man we'll construct.
Corinne didn't see, but in a few minutes she strolled toward the den, balancing her coffee in both hands. With one elbow she eased the door open, and there it was, an innocent, polished cabinet reaching up to her shoulders. Ronald had removed one of the plates from its side, and she peeped into the section where the heart and soul may be located. She only saw an unanatomical array of vacuum tubes and electrical relays, and she felt Ronald at her back.
It just looks like the inside of a jukebox.
The same relay systems used in the simple jukebox are incorporated in a computer. And he beamed, placing one hand lovingly on top of the cabinet.
But, Ronald, it doesn't even resemble a mechanical man.
That's because it doesn't have any appendages as yet. Oh, you know, arms and legs. That's a relatively simple adjustment. And he winked at Curren with a great air of complicity. And I have some excellent ideas along that line. Now run along, I'll be busy most of the day. Corinne ran along. She spent most of the day shopping for weekend necessities. On a rational last-minute impulse, perhaps an unconscious surrender to the machine age, she dug in the grocery deep freeze and brought out a couple of purple steaks. That evening she had to call Ronald 3 times for dinner, and when he came out of the den, she noticed that he closed the door the way one does upon a small child. He chattered about inconsequential matters all through dinner. Corinne knew that his work was going smoothly. A few minutes later she was to know how smoothly. It started when she began to put on her apron to do the dishes. Let that go for now, dear, Ronald said, taking the apron from her, and he went into the den, returning with a small box covered with push-buttons. Now observe carefully, he said, his voice pitched high, and he pushed one of the buttons, waited a second with his ear cocked toward the den, and then pushed another. Corinne heard the turning of metal against metal, and she slowly turned her head. Ah! She suppressed a shriek, clutching Ronald's arm so tightly he almost dropped the control box. Pascal was walking under his own effort, considerably taller with the round aluminium legs that Ronald had given him. 2 metal arms also hung at the sides of the cabinet. One of those rose stiffly as though for balance, and Corinne's mouth opened as she watched the creature jerk awkwardly across the living room.
Oh, Ronald, the fishbowl!
Ronald stabbed knowingly at several buttons. Pascal pivoted toward them, but not before his right arm swung out and almost contemptuously brushed the fishbowl to the floor. Corinne closed her eyes at the crash, and then she scooped up several little golden bodies and rushed for the kitchen. When she returned, Ronald was picking up pieces of glass and dabbing at the pool of water with one of her bathroom towels. Pascal, magnificently aloof, was standing in the center of the mess. I'm sorry. It was my fault. I got confused on the buttons. But Corinne's glances toward the rigid Pascal held no indictment. She was only mystified. There was something wrong here.
But, Ronald, he's so ugly without a head. I thought that all robots...
Oh, no, we would put heads on them for display purposes only. Admittedly, that captures the adaptation of the public. That little adapter shaft at the top could be the neck, of course. And he waved Corinne aside and continued his experiments with a homemade robot. Pascal moved in controlled spasms around the living room. Once he walked just a little too close to the floor-length window, and Corinne stood up nervously, but Ronald had apparently mastered the big black box. With complete confidence, Corinne went into the kitchen to do the dishes. Not until she was elbow-deep in suds did she recall her dreams about the octopus. She looked over her shoulder, and the curious, unwanted feeling came again. The following afternoon, after Ronald had cancelled their Sunday drive into the country, Pascal, with constant exhortations by Ronald at the black box, succeeded in vacuum cleaning the whole living room. Ronald was ecstatic. Now do you understand? A mechanical servant. Think of it! Of course, mass production may be years away, but
Everyone will.
Everyone will have Thursday nights off, said Corinne, but Ronald was already jabbing at buttons as Pascal dragged the vacuum cleaner back to its niche in the closet. Later, Corinne persuaded Ronald to take her to a movie, but not until the last moment she was certain that Pascal wasn't going to be drug along. Every afternoon of the following week, Ronald Lovegear called from the laboratory in New York to ask how Pascal was getting along. Just fine, Curren told him on Thursday afternoon. But he's certainly ruined some of the tomato plants in the garden. He just doesn't seem to be able to hoe in a straight line. Are you certain it's the green button I push? It's probably one of the pressure regulators. I'll check it when I get home. Corinne suspected by his lowered voice that Hardwick had walked into the lab. That night, Pascal successfully washed and dried the dishes, cracking only 1 cup in the process. Corinne spent the rest of the evening sitting in the far corner of the living room, thumbing the pages of a magazine. And on the following afternoon, prompted perhaps by that strange female trait which demands completion of all projects once started, Corinne lingered for several minutes in the vegetable department at the grocery, and she finally picked out a fresh, round, and blushing pumpkin. Later in her kitchen, humming a little tune under her breath, Corinne deftly maneuvered a paring knife to transform the pumpkin into a very reasonable facsimile of a man's head. She placed the pumpkin over the tiny shaft between Pascal's box-shaped shoulders and stepped back. She smiled at the moon-faced idiot grinning back at her. He was complete and not bad-looking. But just before she touched the red button once and the blue button twice, which sent Pascal stumbling out to the backyard to finish weeding the circle of pansies before dinner, she wondered about the gash that was his mouth. She distinctly remembered carving it so that the ends curved upward into a frozen and quite harmless smile. But one end of the toothless grin seemed to sag a little, like the cynical smile of one who knows his powers have been underestimated. Corinne would not have had to worry about her husband's reaction to the new vegetable-topped Pascal. Ronald accepted the transformation good-naturedly, thinking that a little levity once in a while was a good thing. And after all, I'm the one who has to spend all day in the house with... And at this she lowered her voice. With Pascal. But Ronald wasn't listening. He retired to his den to finish the plans for the mass production of competent mechanical men, one for every home in America. He fell asleep with the thought. Corinne and Pascal spent the next 2 weeks going through pretty much the same routine. He methodically jolting through the household chores, and she walking aimlessly from room to room, smoking too many cigarettes. She began to think of Pascal as a boarder. It was strange. At first he'd been responsible for that unwanted feeling, but now his helpfulness around the house had lightened her burden, and he was so cheerful all the time, after living with Ronald's preoccupied frown for 7 years. And then after luncheon one day, when Pascal neglected to shut off the garden hose, she caught herself scolding him as if he were human. Was that a shadow from the curtain waving in the breeze, or did she see a hurt look flit across the mouth of the pumpkin? Corinne put out her hand and patted Pascal's cylindrical wrist. It was warm. Flesh warm. She hurried upstairs and stood breathing heavily with her back to the door. And a little later she thought she heard someone with a heavy step, moving around downstairs. I left the control box down there, she thought. Of course, it's absurd. And at 4 o'clock she went slowly down the stairs to start Ronald's dinner. Pascal was standing by the refrigerator exactly where she'd left him. Not until she had started to peel the potatoes did she notice the little bouquet of pansies in the center of the table. Corinne felt she needed a strong cup of tea, and so she put the water on and placed a cup on the kitchen table. Not until she was going to sit down did she decide that perhaps Pascal should be in the other room. She pressed the red button, the one which should turn him around, and the blue button, which would make him walk into the living room. She heard the little buzz of mechanical life as Pascal began to move, but he didn't go into the other room. He was holding a chair for her, and she sat down rather heavily. A sudden rush of, pleasure reddened her cheeks. Not since my sorority days. Before Pascal's arms moved away, she touched his wrist again softly. Only this time her hand lingered, and his wrist was warm. When do they want Pascal back at the lab? she asked Ronald at dinner that evening, trying to keep her voice casual. "I think I might have him indefinitely, dear. I've got Hardwick convinced I'm working on something revolutionary. Oh, Corinne, you've spilled coffee all over yourself." And the following night Ronald was late in getting home from work. It was raining outside the Newark station, and the cabs deliberately evaded him. He finally caught a bus, which deposited him 1 block from his house, and he cut through the back alley, hurrying through the rain. Just before he started up the stairs, he glanced through the lighted kitchen window, and he stopped, gripping the railing for support. In the living room were Pascal and Corinne. Pascal was reclining leisurely in the fireside chair, and Corinne was standing in front of him. It was the expression on her face which stopped Ronald Lovegear. The look was a compound of restraint and compulsion, the reflection of some deep struggle in Corinne's soul. And then she suddenly leaned forward and pressed her lips to Pascal's full, fleshy pumpkin mouth. Slowly, one of Pascal's aluminum arms moved up and encircled her waist. Dr. Lovegear stepped back into the rain, and he stood there for several minutes. The rain curled around the brim of his hat, dropped to his face, and rolled down his cheeks with the slow agitation of tears. When finally he walked around to the front and stamped heavily up the stairs, Corinne greeted him with a flush in her cheeks. Ronald told her that he didn't feel quite up to dinner. "Just coffee, please." And when it was ready, he sipped slowly, watching Corinne's figure as she moved around the room. She avoided looking at the aluminum figure in the chair. Ronald put his coffee down, walked over to Pascal, and, gripping him by the shoulders, dragged him into the den. Corinne stood looking at the closed door and listened to the furious pounding. 10 minutes later, Ronald came out and went straight to the phone. Yes, immediately." And while he sat there waiting, Corinne walked upstairs. Ronald didn't offer to help the freight men drag the box outside. When they'd gone, he went into the den and came back with a pumpkin, and he opened the back door and hurled it out into the rain. It cleared the back fence and rolled down the alley, stopping in a small puddle in the cinders. After a while, the water level reached the mouth. There was a soft choking sound. The boy who found it the next morning looked at the mouth and wondered why anyone would carve such a sad jack-o'-lantern. That's the end. Well, that was much less lurid than I remember it to be when the first time around when I read this. I remembered it to be much more, how do I put this gently? Very lewd. So maybe I'll cut that content warning section out of the audio. That was fine. That was no big deal. That was not that bad. I might cut out the content warning section there. So if you're in the recording and you are like, "What do you mean, what content warning?" That's why. That story was much less lewd than I remember it to be from when I first read it. But it's a very interesting concept, and I'm a fan of it. Anyway, I think we're going to call it an evening there. It's a little bit of a shorter episode, but I thought Dunwich Horror was going to take me longer to finish, and I didn't have anything prepared, so we kind of just improvised with those short stories. Anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful week, and next week's episode, I think you may find there's a pleasant surprise, so feel free to tune in on that. This has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.